Hi, welcome to Talking Brains, a podcast about mental health, books, and what makes brains happy. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie Sarkis. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 3 of Talking Brains. Thanks for joining us. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie Sarkis at stephaniesarkis.com. You may remember this episode's guest, Rick Moskovitz, from Season 1, when we talked about memory, trauma, and state-dependent learning. Today, I'll be talking to Rick about his new science fiction trilogy, his writing process, and his previous books on borderline personality disorder and recovered memories. Rick Moskovitz is a Harvard-educated psychiatrist who taught psychotherapy and spent nearly 4 decades listening to his patients tell their stories. After leaving practice, he in turn became a storyteller, writing science fiction that explores the psychological consequences of living in a world of expanding possibilities, including even the prospect of evading death. His characters deal with enduring moral and emotional struggles against a backdrop of a near-future world that is still dealing with environmental crises as it navigates the intersection of human and artificial intelligence. Rick can be found at rickmoskovitz.com. That's rickmoskovitz.com. Thank you for listening, and make sure you hit that subscribe button and give us a rating. It's appreciated. On with the podcast. Enjoy. Welcome back to the podcast, Rick.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here.
And we're here to talk about your trilogy of books. So you have 3 books out, Stand In for Dying, Brink of Life, and The Creators. So if you could tell me a little bit about the genre of your books and what they're about, and then we'll talk a little bit about the psychiatry piece of your life.
Okay, so the Brink of Life trilogy is a story that takes place in the mid-21st century when civilization is still struggling both with problems that technology has failed to solve and new problems created by technological advances. The boundaries between man and machine have been blurred. Our minds are enhanced with cybernetic implants that provide seamless access to all the information in the data cloud. And at the same time, artificial intelligence entities have exceeded humans in their capacity to process ordinary information and are learning to read and express human emotions in order to become more like us. So at this point in time, a number of possibilities have emerged on the horizon, including the possibility of extending life indefinitely. And a number of technologies are working in that direction, but one of the more interesting concepts is the possibility that consciousness could be uploaded possibly to a machine or to the data cloud, or maybe even transferred to the body of another human being. And the possibility of uploading consciousness is something that has been predicted by a well-known science fiction writer, Ray Kurzweil, who talks about the singularity, something that he predicts will happen somewhere in the mid-2030s, when technology is advanced to the point that artificial intelligence will have the capacity to create itself and will, outstrip the capacity of human intelligence. And a byproduct of that is the possibility that human intelligence could possibly be uploaded into a machine, into an artificial intelligence, into the cloud, and theoretically into another human being. So that becomes the basis for a stand-in for dying. In that scenario, a black market has developed for wealthy older individuals to contract with healthy, young, but down and out individuals to occupy their bodies when the older man dies in exchange for a fortune. So in this scenario, there are covert organizations jockeying for power as they exploit people's hunger for everlasting life. At the same time, there are sentient AIs who are now struggling for their position in a society that views them as other and views carbon-based humans as superior.
Does that get into in the book that they refer to AIs as Spud, which seems kind of a demeaning term? I know it's an acronym for AIs, but does that signify this feeling of less than that humans are having towards AI?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Spud is actually a combination of acronyms for sentient processing units and sentient processing devices. But the outcome, the term Spud, of course, sounds like potato.
Hmm.
And yes, it is indeed a demeaning epithet.
So instead of in some books where it's the AIs are taking over already, now you're in the situation where the AIs are seen as being less than, but then that also somehow inspires them to rise up, would you say?
Yeah, they're being seen as less than, but they're
Hmm.
also seen as a threat. And at least some of the AIs just want to be part of society.
Hmm.
They want to learn to be more human. They want to learn to interact with humans the way humans interact with each other. And they want to have rights like the humans do, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They want to be equals. So they become the new underclass.
And currently, where are we at with this type of technology? I know that you said that Kurzweil says in the mid 2030s. Where are we at right now?
We're not anywhere near being able to upload mental contents to the cloud at this point. And there are all kinds of reasons why that probably would not be an effective way to extend your life anyway, but it's theoretically built into this story. So we're not anywhere near that. However, the other technology that's featured in this book that I call the ambrosia conversion is a process that arrests aging. And in the story, the ambrosia conversion can be obtained. You can arrest aging up to about the age of 30, and then after that, it's too late to apply the process. That technology may be fast upon us. There are some very, very interesting studies. One particular one done at Harvard by a researcher named Amy Wagers, in which she's hooked up the circulation of elderly mice with the circulation of younger mice. And the result was that the older mice became rejuvenated. And their age, basically biological age, rolled back nicely over time. And further, part of that research is that they've managed to isolate at least one protein that may be one of the circulating factors responsible for this result. So it's very possible that we may have drugs, or we may have some other processes, or possibly plasma infusions that enable people not only to stop aging, but to roll back their aging, which is amazing.
And I just want to let listeners know that that is an actual study with the
That's an
mice.
actual study.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's not
that's an
science
actual
fiction.
study,
That's
and it's several years ago already.
yeah, yeah, that's reality. I remember reading that. We're in the processes of, at least in the beginning, of looking at telomeres and how, and you mentioned in the book about telomeres, that how to possibly regenerate or stop the deterioration
Yeah,
of.
keep them shortening over time,
Right.
because they seem to be the most reliable marker of aging. So there are a number of people who theorize that the first person to live to 150 has already been born.
Mm.
Uh,
Hmm.
and it may be possible, within the next half a century to extend life to hundreds of years. So that's interesting. It's also somewhat daunting, because you have to consider, if it becomes possible, if it's possible, is it desirable?
Right.
I mean, certainly people think they want to live forever, but when you start looking at the reality, is it possible? Is it a good thing for the individual? Is it a good thing for society? Particularly when you look at an already overcrowded world.
Mm-hmm.
If we all hang around forever, is there room for new people?
Right. And I think from an ADHD perspective, would that get kind of boring to live forever?
Well, it might be. So,
Yeah.
so all of this technology and all of these expectations, and particularly expectations of, idealistic young people who think, maybe I have a shot at living forever, raises for me the unintended consequences.
Mm-hmm.
What could possibly go wrong with that aspect? And that's where good fiction starts, is you start with a premise and what could possibly go wrong with that.
And what inspires your writing? Have you been a writer even when you were younger, of fiction?
I actually had an incredible creative writing instructor in the 10th grade, Mr. Campbell, and he gave us some really interesting exercises. And the one that I remember most is we were instructed to write a fairy tale in the style of one of our favorite authors.
So, what a great exercise.
Yeah. So I wrote the story of Pinocchio as it may have been told by Robert Penn Warren.
Oh, how neat. So you start with creative writing. You said that's in the 10th grade with Mr. Campbell.
Yeah.
And then did you continue writing throughout medical school?
Not creative writing. Mm-hmm. So my next big writing project was Lost in the Mirror. So back in the early 90s, when there was very little written for people with borderline personality disorder, for patients and families, at that point there was almost nothing on available. I decided that it would make sense to write a user-friendly book that explained to people what they were going through and why they may be going through it and how to deal with it. So I began writing Lost in the Mirror in the early 90s, and in those days I wrote most of it on yellow legal pads. That was the technology of the day. I remember I squeezed in my writing on airplanes while I was traveling to conferences and things and pieced it together. And in the course of submitting it for publication, it went through a number of revisions. And the last revision was the product of some inspiration. It occurred to me to write a continuing case that stretched throughout the book and integrated with the subject of each of the chapters. So there'd be a couple of pages at the end of each chapter that related to that chapter, but also was part of a continuing story. Mm-hmm. And that turned out to be about a 40-page short story. It was, fiction. It was not an actual patient, but it was a composite. And it was my first real effort at a lengthier piece of fiction. So that was fun. And then I put that away and I got really absorbed with my practice, which was very time consuming. And then a few years later, I was doing a lot of teaching about memory. And I think we've talked about this in our earlier conversation. And I decided to write a novel about recovered memories. And that was Carousel Music.
Yeah, an excellent fiction version of borderline personality and the idea of created memory, repressed memory. And Lost in the Mirror is the book on borderline personality disorder. So I've highly recommended that book over the years. So, and we talked about, like you said in the podcast you appeared before, we talked about the idea of created memories.
And it also appears again in a different form in Brink of Life.
Oh, right. Okay.
Recovered memories. So I reprised that theme again in my later science fiction. So then again, kind of put away the creative writing for almost a decade and retired at the end of 2010. A year or so later, I started writing my first science fiction book, which was at that point called The Methuselarity Transformation. It didn't actually do very well, partly because it had such an obscure title. And the title was both, off-putting and unmemorable.
Oh, because it related to a religious figure? Or... Well,
it related to Methuselah, the person in the Bible who apocryphally lived 900 years. Right. It also related to, there's a fellow named Aubrey de Grey who writes about life extension, and he coined the term Methuselarity.
Oh.
So, and it was sort of a riff on the episode titles from The Big Bang Theory that I thought were kind of cool and clever.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
But it was too clever and too obscure. And, as a writer, there are a number of things you learn along the way. And one of them is you have to have an accessible title and you have to have a killer cover. Well, I thought I had a really good cover on that book, but the title was its downfall. So published that in 2014. I'll take you on a little sidetrack. So in my travels, ran into some interesting people, including a producer who worked with Steven Spielberg on some documentaries that relate to Spielberg's Shoah Foundation, which is about memorializing the Holocaust. And June read my book, and she said, I've never produced fiction, but this has to be a movie or a TV series. We need to do this. So we got into a dialogue and we got into a process, and we actually ended up pitching the story to a number of outlets and got some interest, but also got some interesting critiques. And out of the critiques came some ideas for how to make the story better. So I decided that I needed to rewrite Methuselarity Transformation, reimagine it, make it bigger, different, spin it out in a much more complex way. And the result was A Stand-In for Dying.
So I have some questions about when you've written something, and for people that are writers or just anyone that's confronting criticism, how did you absorb that critique and then turn into something else without personalizing it?
Well, some critiques are hard not to personalize. But as a writer, I really want to know what's going to grab people, what people are really going to be interested in reading or watching on the screen. The ultimate result of the quest is I actually got an offer for a contract, but in the course of things, they had changed the story so much that I thought it was unrecognizable and that it wasn't nearly as good as my original story, and I said, no thanks. There was the temptation, but it felt like they were using the idea to spin out their own thing, and that just didn't work for me. But one of the critiques that I took to heart that I thought was interesting was that there always needs to be a ticking clock. There needs to be something that starts at the beginning of the story that threatens the main characters with annihilation at any moment. There needs to be an ongoing threat that can destroy everything. So I introduced a ticking clock into A Stand-In for Dying that wasn't in Methuselarity Transformation.
Which is extremely effective, by the way. The ticking clock concept is the anticipation, and that's part of the aspect of the thriller, to have that constant, you're up against
part of the
time.
aspect of the thriller is, something can wipe out your hero at any time.
And what's your process of writing? Do you lock yourself in a room for a couple hours every day, or do you write when the moment inspires you, or what's your process?
It's a little of this and a little of that. I have my own process. When I'm on a roll, I try and write something every day, but that might last for 2 or 3 weeks, and then I might hit a wall and not write anything for a couple of months, and then pick it up again and start again, maybe write for a week and off for a week. But when it rolls, sometimes I can, write every day for a couple of months and put out most of a book. I have a blend of planning and organic development. So I do sketch out an overall plot, an overall outline at the beginning that frames the work, but it doesn't constrain the work. My outline is a starting point, but the story inevitably changes as I go along. So there's a plot outline, but it allows for fluidity, and plenty of fluidity happens. I have found a particular device that works for me, that may not work for anybody else on the planet, but that gets my creative processes going. So if I'm writing and I run into a plot point that I can't figure out, my protagonist gets into a fix and I'm trying to figure out how he's going to get out of that fix, or how she is going to get out of that fix, because I have both male and female protagonists in the various books, and I'm stuck. I work out 3 times a week. I spend a half hour on either an elliptical trainer or a recumbent bike. And I really punch it out. I mean, I go all out, get my pulse rate up, 150, 160, really pushing it. I have rock music going on and often also have a TV screen in front of me on the bike. And in that unlikely environment, the answers come to me. The inspiration comes. So chapters get written in a half hour on the elliptical machine while I'm listening to rock music, looking at a TV screen and working out. And it has something to do with endorphins and who knows what, but it works. It works. And I get off the device and I write some notes and then I go home and write. And those are my most productive days. And some of the more interesting plot twists have come out of that process.
So the sensory overload actually leads to creating more. That's really interesting.
It's crazy. It's multitasking, exercise, music, TV monitor, but somehow that all leads to a creative burst.
Do you find yourself writing in the parking lot of the gym sometimes, or can you make it home first?
I can make it home.
Okay.
I'll get into the notes app on my phone and I'll jot down a few things and then I'll go home and I'll sit down and with my laptop and knock it out.
And I realized for my writing process, exercise is very important too, especially when you get in the high intensity level. So I never realized how much it actually helps me work out things. And I write nonfiction, so but you can also get kind of stuck there too. So I never realized how much that helps. That once I exercise, I'll say, oh, there's something I can add to wrap up that chapter, or whatnot. So that's a very powerful process.
Does a lot of good things for cognitive processes in general, but the actual time while exercising seems to be remarkable for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard that from other people too. That exercise is a key piece of just their well-being too. Because of the psychic stress of writing. So,
yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So, and tell me about just your history of being a psychiatrist, and you were in practice you're still a psychiatrist, but you were in practice for 30, 40 years?
I graduated from medical school in 1973. I did a year of internship, so I had a year of internal medicine, basically, then 3 years of psychiatric residency, finished in 1977. And then I went to the University of Florida and I was on the faculty there for 8 years until 1985. During which time I got tenured and all of that. And then I spent 25 years in practice in Ocala.
What started your interest in repressed memories and recalled memories?
Well, my background as a psychiatrist, a lot of psychiatrists these days are trained mainly in psychopharmacology. I was trained in an era in which psychoanalytic theory was still important. So, I was trained to have good psychotherapy skills and practiced throughout my years of practice a combination of biological therapy and psychotherapy. I never scheduled a patient for less than a half hour. In a typical day, I had about half my day of hour-long sessions and the rest half-hour-long sessions. I spent time with patients. I learned about their lives. And in the course of that, I watched people remember things that happened in their lives. And there were times when the memories that I heard were compelling and convincing. And there were other times when I wasn't sure that what they were telling me or what they were remembering was actually what happened. And I can't tell you right now what the clues were at the time, but it raised some issues. And back in the 90s, there was a whole movement for therapists to deliberately go after repressed memories. There was a book, huge book, that was a Bible for a lot of therapists called The Courage to Heal, that taught patients how to look for things that they may have forgotten from their childhood. And that whole process in the book and the culture behind it became the center of a controversy. It was sort of like, Democrats and Republicans who each believe exactly what they believe and they don't want to listen to the other side. Well, the people who believed that repressed memories could all be trusted and the people who believed that repressed memories were, recovered memories were very subjective and probably shouldn't be trusted were in opposition to each other, and there was a lot of writing on the subject, and there were a lot of lectures on the subject. So it was very much out in the culture of psychotherapy at the time that this was a problem. So when I wrote Carousel Music, I wanted to present both sides of the controversy. I wanted to, kind of bring the whole controversy to life, not take, one side or the other as gospel, but try and show how each side may have something worth considering, and that the truth may be somewhere in the middle.
I'm remembering now when you would speak for my classes at UF, one of the memories that you had mentioned that someone had was verbatim from a movie, and that tipped you off that it was possibly not something that actually happened.
Absolutely, yeah. She actually had a past life memory, from something that supposedly happened 2,000 years ago that she discovered some weeks after telling me the memory. Was listening to HBO running in the other room and heard something familiar and went in and saw the scene that she had described to me, and she'd been watching Revenge of the Nerds.
Right.
Yeah.
I remember that. Yeah.
So at that point, I stopped looking for past life memories. I thought, well, maybe there was some possibility of that, but I had my mind open, but my mind closed to that particular possibility at that time.
And then also, like you said, the repressed creative memories plays into your new work as well in your trilogy.
Yes. So in book 2 of the Brink of Life trilogy, which is called Brink of Life, it starts with a woman who kind of bursts into consciousness out of nowhere in the middle of a funeral. She suddenly becomes conscious with total amnesia, has no idea who she is or how she got there, and she's in the middle of a funeral, and the funeral appears to be the funeral of her husband. And she then sets out on a quest to recover memories and figure out who she is.
We also talked to before we recorded that your genre is hard science fiction. If you could explain a little bit about what hard science fiction is.
Yeah, so science fiction is a spectrum, and at one end of the spectrum is pure fantasy, where, basically the premises for the science fiction are made up. And at the other end of the spectrum is scientific rigor, in which, nothing that appears in the story doesn't have some basis in scientific reality. So hard science fiction is that end of the spectrum. Maybe there's some stretching of the scientific data, but pretty much every premise in a hard science fiction work is based in scientific data. So give you an example of how hard science fiction fits in my trilogy. I've already talked about the ambrosia conversion and rolling back aging or arresting aging as being something that's certainly conceivable. Talked about the idea of uploading mental contents not being part of any scientific finding at the time, but predictions by people who have some reason to believe that science will move that way. There's another kind of parenthetical element that I introduce in A Stand-In for Dying that I had a lot of fun with, that I consider hard science fiction. I invent a religion, and it's a creationist religion, a new creationist religion in the mid-21st century that is based on a scientific finding. And in the story, the scientific finding that's the basis for this religion is the discovery within some of the segments of our DNA that don't code for proteins, but have been called junk DNA in the past, that people don't know what the function is, that the discovery that within some of these segments were actual messages that could be decoded, language that could be decoded, that start by telling the story of the creation of the universe as we understand it. Big Bang and all of that. And it's all in the DNA. And once that's discovered, a lot of people flock to the Church of the Double Helix, which is the religion that evolves out of this discovery. So how is this hard science fiction? Well, there is something called the search for genomic SETI. So SETI is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. All of the telescopic arrays that are looking through the universe for messages from distant galaxies that may be sent by intelligent entities. Genomic SETI is a search for intelligent messages within our genome. And it's been found that there are segments of our DNA that make sense from a semantic point of view. And by that I mean they have characteristics that seem typical of language. And although they haven't been deciphered exactly, what the language is and what message might be within the language, there is enough evidence that it could be language that people are thinking that this may be a way that some other civilization has tried to communicate with us.
So there's a syntax to it.
So there's a syntax to it, exactly. So it's just sort of another jump from that to actually decoding the message and discovering that, yes, an intelligent entity may indeed have been communicating through our DNA. The other piece is that there are scientists who have learned to manipulate DNA who have recorded entire books in DNA and have recorded film clips in DNA. So not only is it possible for an intelligent entity to write messages in our DNA, we already can do that. We are an intelligent entity that has the capacity to do that. So all of that put together makes for a really interesting story. So in A Stand-In for Dying, I introduced the Church of the Double Helix and this belief that some intelligent entity, whether you would call it God or an intelligent civilization, an extraterrestrial intelligence, may have written some or part of our genome. The Creators is the last of the trilogy. And in the Creators, I have a bright young woman who is introduced in A Stand-In for Dying, who decides to pursue the origin of the Creators. She wants to find the civilization and communicate with the civilization that has written at least some segments of our genome. So the heart of that story is her quest to find the Creators. And it leads her on a journey that takes her not just to another part of the universe, but to another dimension. Also at one point in the story to a different point in time. So that's the most fanciful of the trilogy. It was frankly the most fun to write. It also has a thriller component with warring factions and people in danger and other protagonists in the story, all of whom eventually get entwined with one another. And I think brings the trilogy to a very satisfying close.
So, and I was also going to ask you too about your background, your undergrad background, because you said that not only you're a psychiatrist, but you're also a scientist, and that informs your writing.
Mm-hmm. So actually, when I was in high school, I was kind of a math nerd. Most of my emphasis in high school and the early part of my college was math and science, chemistry and physics. My undergraduate degree at Harvard was in chemistry and physics. So I have a very solid scientific background, and although I haven't had a career in those areas, I've kept up as much as possible with the science, and I read a lot. I find articles on the internet these days that I like, but for decades, I read every issue of Discover magazine cover to cover and various other Scientific American, various other magazines that are designed mostly for sophisticated lay people. So I feel like I have enough of a scientific basis to write intelligent science fiction.
So for authors that are getting in the science fiction genre, it sounds like it's a good idea just to get your hands on whatever scientific writing you can, whether that's journal articles or, like you said, sophisticated lay people, periodicals. Would you say that's a good way to start? Just dive into whatever article you can find and absorb it?
Just dive in. There are a lot of websites that publish nothing but interesting scientific articles for people. There's a lot of material out there.
What advice would you give to authors that maybe are starting out with their first piece of writing?
Well, first of all, I think it's a learning curve. They say it takes 10,000 hours in any discipline to become an expert. And I think that certainly goes double for writing. It takes a long time. So you need to practice, and you need to start anywhere. You don't have to start by writing novels. You can start by writing short stories. You can start by writing paragraphs in response to a prompt. You can write some poetry, whatever makes sense. When you start writing seriously, get feedback. I put my early drafts out to a variety of eyes, friends, sometimes experts. For Lost in the Mirror and Carousel Music, I engaged professional editors that I found that helped me tighten up my writing and found, some of the big flaws in my writing. When I wrote Carousel Music, for example, one of the critiques was that I tended to write a chapter that ended up with a neat conclusion. And she said, no, if you're writing fiction, you need to not have the conclusion come at the end of the chapter. You need to leave a cliffhanger so that they'll read on to the next thing. I had to reprogram my brain to go for the cliffhangers. Now, one of my favorite authors is Dan Brown. And Dan Brown has a number of characteristics to his writing. He's very engaging, but there's always a cliffhanger. I mean, you can't finish a chapter in one of his books and go to bed.
Right.
And go to sleep.
Right.
You got to go on to the next thing. And the other thing about his books aren't short, but his chapters are. You get little digestible bites. And you know that a chapter's short, so there's kind of a temptation. I can read one more chapter. It's only 5 pages. I can read one more chapter.
Right. It's almost like a drug.
It's like a drug. So you go from chapter to chapter to chapter, and before you know, you've read 500 pages. So in some ways, the structure of my writing is modeled after that. As you've seen, I write short books. My books are Stand for Dying is 333 pages. Brink of Life is 160, and The Creators is 173. Not long by novel standards. The second two arguably could be called novellas. But aside from the brevity of the overall work, I write in short pieces. So my chapters tend to be short, and as much as I can, I end them on cliffhangers. So they're digestible. You can take in a chapter no matter what your attention span. You can take in one of my chapters reasonably easily and then be engaged and hopefully tempted to go on to the next chapter.
Right. And I was able to read it even without my Adderall.
Well, there you go.
so right. Yeah. And for that, I need to have a book that's really engaging. And if I really like it, I can hyper focus. Yep. And that's what I did with your book. So for people that may not have been able to read books before because of attention issues, I think they'll find that your book is written in a way very similar to how my 10 Simple Solutions is written, where you can pick up a part of it, read a chapter, put it down, do something, come back. You want to go back to it, but you also you're kind of chewing on the concepts as you're transferring onto another task, and then you inevitably go back. So I think it's a really good book for people that may not have been able to read fiction before.
Well, thank you. And some of that comes from my perspective as a reader. So you'd think that going through college and medical school, that I'd be a whiz of a reader. My dirty little secret is I'm a terribly, terribly slow reader, and it's really hard to keep my attention. And nonfiction especially, it's just really hard for me. So I read very slowly and deliberately. I'm intimidated by longer works. I've occasionally delved into what you'd call literature, long works like James Michener's The Source or Donna Tartt's The Goldfinch. or even the Da Vinci Code, which is almost 600 pages. But for the most part, I like to stay 300 pages or less, or I've got to devote a month to it. And I don't want to devote a month to one thing. So I've gravitated myself to shorter books and to novellas and short stories, and that works for me. So, I hope that it also works for people, who are like me.
So write something that you want to read yourself.
So I write something exactly that I would want to read myself. And, when I've gotten to the end of Brink of Life or got to the end of The Creators, I looked at it and I said, gee, this is awfully short. This, almost doesn't even qualify for a novel. But, I'd read it through again and I'd see how it integrated and think, it's a complete story. It's still a complete story. So it's done. I decide it's done, told. The other thing, if you were to characterize my writing, I tend to write clear but tight prose. I don't have a lot of extraneous description. I have enough description to enable the reader to imagine the scene and maybe fill in some of the details from their own imagination. But a lot of my writing reads like a screenplay.
There's not a lot of fluff.
There's not a lot of fluff. There's not a lot of flowery. I'm not going for the flowery description that somebody's going to quote and say, boy, that was gorgeous. What a great description of a sunset. But by writing dialogue heavy fiction, it keeps things moving along. It makes things visually easy to take in on the page because dialogue runs, a line or two, space, line or two, space, and the dialogue tells the story. So there is dialogue and there is action, and the mantra of fiction writers is show, don't tell. I show a lot of what happens through dialogue or through other interactions between the characters.
Well, thank you for being on the podcast. I really appreciate it. And congratulations on your trilogy.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Talking Brains. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie Sarkis at stephaniesarkis.com. And Rick Moskovitz can be found at rickmoskovitz.com. That's RickMoskovitz.com. And thanks again to Rick for appearing on the podcast. And thank you for listening, and make sure you hit the subscribe button and give us a rating. It's appreciated. Thank you and have a great day.